summit. It's a great opportunity for us to share some information about work that's been happening and ongoing in Colorado that is really trying to take advantage, capitalize on strong community interest around pollinator conservation and help to give shape to that interest to reinforce, create policies that hopefully in the end may actually, also magnify on the ground practices, how land managers in Colorado make changes in the way we manage our state lands that will in fact, create better pollinator habitat and benefit pollinators. So today I'm going to be joined by Joyce Kennedy, who's the Executive Director for People and Pollinators Action Network, and also Dr. Adrian Carper, who's an Assistant Professor Adjunct from the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Colorado Boulder. This is just one of Adrian's many different hats. And I'm Steve Armstead. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. So we'll each kind of share part of the presentation and some of the different aspects of how that community interest and collaboration amongst many different constituents is all important about driving policy and hopefully ending up in better land management practices. So what we do hope to cover today is to at least touch base on, where and how we've gone about supporting broad community interest, trying to find champions within the community members that really can then kind of drive policy support and amongst our legislatures or amongst our state government officials that would help to magnify, again, changes that would benefit practices across our state lands for pollinators. We also want to share some information about the importance and how we went about engaging and bringing scientists into the effort to try to validate and understand the importance of conserving pollinators and important of the actions we were trying to propose, but also keep them engaged too, to continue to be a part of the solutions and the ways we were trying to learn and make improvements in the lands. And then also we wanted to share information about kind of the importance that, you can have all these great intentions and policies, but unless it's magnifying and making changes on the ground, you're probably not getting the full benefit of what you're trying to achieve. So we wanted to also make sure we were engaging and collaborating with state land managers to learn about the practices that are already at play and make sure what we were making recommendations around management practices were feasible and doable in the end. A lot of what we'll talk about today is kind of given shape to a large study that was supported by the state to look at the health of Colorado pollinators and to make recommendations around land management practices that affect the state lands, but it also is quite relevant at a bunch of different scales, whether it's a local level, a regional level. So, the practices themselves are quite appropriate to place in many different contexts. And then we'll hopefully leave with a few parting comments and thoughts just to kind of share a little bit about what we've learned. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joyce, who'll share a little bit of information about kind of how we, managed and grew our community interests.
Hi, everybody. So it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I am also pleased to be here with my Colorado Pollinator Network Steering Committee colleagues, as we have been reflecting just on how much we've accomplished in the past 10 years. And even in the wake of some devastating actions at the federal level, we really remain optimistic that we can take steps forward because of the groundwork that's been laid here. And we've found success with one win built on another, even with challenges along the way. So there's excellent momentum here in Colorado that we plan to maintain. Change the slide, please. I'm going to share some examples of successes and challenges. However, I most want to convey is that the partnerships and relationships in the name of pollinator protection are why we have this story to tell. And each group and individual we work with brings a unique perspective and skill we can draw on. As an organization, People and Pollinators Action Network was founded 10 years ago to address the gap in policies and awareness about pollinators. Some of our initial actions We're at the Capitol concerning pesticide issues. And so we're always seeking opportunities to engage with state leaders, agencies, because we want to elevate the importance of pollinators. Change the slide. And I'm giving kind of an overview of how we've all worked together. So we co-hosted the state's first pollinator community gathering at the Colorado Pollinator Summit. And this year we're celebrating the 10th anniversary. So we're really excited to be working together for this decade. Organizing this team with my colleagues here has required time. And really, for more than half of the network's existence, we've concentrated on organizing this summit, something we do well, knowing that over time, enhanced collaborations and opportunities will develop organically. So we just kind of had the patience to work through that. So, for example, we've added some of these other actions. We now hold a collaboration day right after the summit. We host what we call the Big Day of Bugs at the Denver Botanic Gardens. And this day is dedicated to sharing and community science observations through iNaturalist. And then we also hold quarterly Colorado Pollinator Network meetings. And as these trusted partnerships grow, I really am confident that we will achieve even more. Slide change, please. People in Pollinators Action Network and the Colorado Pollinator Network collaborate across all levels for success. So ranging really from the governor's office to the legislature with our legislative pollinator champions, state agencies, local leaders, the scientific community, numerous partners, and the backyard pollinator enthusiast as well. So I'm just going to give you a bit of advice, and that is build coalitions and partnerships wherever you go, as it takes many voices to change policy and practices. Build this trust at every level. Seek out allies and form alliances with unexpected stakeholders who may share a common purpose. Provide science-based accurate information. And get out of silos, whether it's in state government or within nonprofits. Bring people into the same room. This approach has helped us get state agency staff working together. Lay the groundwork. By thinking about our ultimate outcomes you want to achieve, then you can better collaborate for success. And I can't reiterate enough that we need many voices in these areas because just a few are not going to have the same impact. State and local leaders tend to be pretty accessible. So get out and build those relationships now so that when you do have an ask for them, they will be more willing to support you if you've built that trust. Maintain a network of experts and stakeholders that can work together for this common good. The coalitions we've built have been that to us. Slide change, please. Colorado's leadership on pollinator issues has resulted from incremental steps built on these relationships. There's a place for small new policies, and some of them are popping up here on the screen, that can lead to larger wins with time and patience. Policy wins in Colorado include the designation of Colorado's first pollinator highway. And this concept arose from our relationships with the Colorado Department of Transportation, and we hope will lead to new policy proposals in the future. And there's even a pollinator team now that's meeting at CDOT and bringing in some other agency representatives. We ask the governor each year to designate June as Colorado Pollinator Month. And so we really encourage lots of activity and education during June. And a small but mighty license plate pollinator license plate bill is now resulting in more and more pollinator license plates on Colorado roads. And in turn, the donations that come in from that plate are creating new habitat through a small grant program. And of course, pesticide-related bills are more complex in Colorado. Well, we know pretty much everywhere, but we've not shied away from those types of policy proposals, even though it can be more fun to talk about bees and flowers, and it can be a building block in forming relationships. And while there haven't been any significant pesticide policy changes, a baby step bill designated neonics as limited use pesticides a few years ago. However, more policy work is needed to reduce pesticide use in Colorado, of course. Slide change, please. Although an ambitious pollinator health bill with multiple proposals, including strategies for pollinator or pesticide reduction, didn't pass in 2022, we successfully championed a new bill that resulted in a native pollinating insect health study, authored by my colleagues here, and they'll be discussing it in detail. Slide change. The success of this bill, which led to the study, was partly due, again, to a relationship we had built with the Department of Natural Resources. And this study is the first of its kind in the US, and it's a kind of state of the state. It's a state level assessment of native pollinators that has really established an incredible state pollinator protection framework. And it has a wealth of recommendations for pollinator conservation that will really help us with what we want to accomplish as a state going forward. Slide change. Already, 6 new permanent positions have been established to lead the work at the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, including a pollinator specialist. And this new biodiversity group will increase these coordinated efforts and communication between state agencies. Also, due to the study groundwork, a new state policy gives state statutory authority to study and conserve invertebrates and rare plants. And so in closing my part of the presentation, we want to encourage other states to follow this kind of a model. It's a groundbreaking study, and we're, along with Steve and Adrian, are here to support that. Certainly, we'll have emails for you at the end of the presentation, because not only conducting the study with the wealth of information it provides, but it's informing our efforts as we continue to work to solve issues like protecting our biodiversity and increasing native plant supply, reducing pesticide use. So it's really having a big impact on our work here in Colorado. So thank you all, and I'm going to pass it off to Adrian now. Take it away, Adrian.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joyce. Hopefully everybody can hear me back here. So yeah, I just want to start out by thanking Joyce. Really, this summit is about boots on the ground practices, right? And I think one of the things we take for granted is all the boots on the ground in conversations with our legislators and our land managing agencies at higher levels to understand the importance of these kind of practices. And really, that's what I'm going to talk about. So Joyce has been out there with her colleagues, beating the drum about why this is important. And I've been trying to connect the scientific community to a lot of those different efforts, right? And so I figured I would take my opportunity here to talk a little bit about how I've worked to build scientific support for both policy and practice around pollinators here in Colorado. And so, a lot of this is driven by what's really an old school kind of thought about academics, which is us up in our ivory towers conducting fundamental research. And yet that's really not the new paradigm. Applied ecological research is kind of par for the course around a lot of different institutions, especially around pollinators and pollinator conservation. And increasingly, we're looking at ways to have transparent research to get that data to the people that need it and to share it with communities who are really interested. And so I want to try to take this opportunity to talk about how I've brought scientists to the discussion here in Colorado about pollinator conservation, using an example from the Colorado Native Pollinating Insect Health Study, and hopefully how we've been using this interaction to build some momentum around pollinator conservation in the state. So next slide, please, Steve. And so, first and foremost, I just want to acknowledge that I think philosophically that engaging with our communities as scientists is a fundamental responsibility, right? As someone who's educated about the issues, the ecology, and the problems that our pollinators face, really, if I want to value those organisms and the impacts that they have on our ecosystems, I should be out there talking with practitioners on the ground, like in the bottom left, engaging with community members around important policy like the Pollinator Health Study bill itself, but also bringing those researchers to the discussions. And so across the top are pictures of some pretty famous pollination ecologists here in Colorado who I've been able to convince through these coordinated interactions to do things like come to our summit and present at our pollinating insect on their research at our Colorado Pollinator Summit, but also to testify in state legislature for the importance of some of these policies, right? And I think this coalition of really on the ground expertise from scientists and community members and organizations and agencies has been one of the real keys in getting successful legislation passed. So next slide, Steve. But I also think it's a fundamental responsibility for all of us scientists to engage with the communities writ large, right? I mean, because we have the knowledge, there are a lot of people who are really thirsty for that knowledge, want to know how they can help, and just doing the little things can really go a long way in helping create a more informed public, especially around pollinators, why we're concerned about their declines, and all of the little things you can do to help support them. So, next slide, Steve. And that really I like to highlight that community aspect of it because this whole native pollinating insect health study is really a community effort. So Steve, you can play the animation. This was really a huge document, over 300 pages that we put together in collaboration with Colorado State University Extension, and a huge shout out to the Xerces Society and Steve for working with our state agencies to really do an in-depth analysis of what conservation practices and opportunities exist. For my part, I mostly worked on the framing of this document and the scientific review and bringing all of Colorado's scientists together. And so we're not going to have time to go in depth over this study, but I highly recommend you check out the link to it on the best practices website and check out the contents to see. It's like an a la carte menu of whatever you're interested in. If you're in Colorado, you can find some information about it. So next slide, Steve. And so I engaged a whole bunch of scientists for this report. Researchers from Colorado State University, from the University of Colorado Boulder, University of Denver and CU Denver, as well as researchers from the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, where between them and CU, we've studied pollinators for collectively over 150 years. And those researchers, of course, come from all over the country to study pollinators at Rumble. And so a lot of what we know about long-term interactions in our bee communities come from Colorado and should be a model for other states. Next slide, Steve. And so we did a whole lot of scientific stuff within this report. The scientific review makes a lot of sense, like talking about some of the limitations to even our understanding of how worried we should be. Like the fact that when you look at the amount of published animal diversity out there, the relative slice in that left pie chart there, you can see that's yellow, is quite small. Only about 3% of all published animal records are actually insects, right? And when you look on the right, within that tiny little 3%, most of what we know is about beetles, and then less about butterflies and moths in yellow, and then in the lower left of that one, the blue, which is Hymenoptera, ants, bees, and wasps. And yet that real limitation in the amount of data we have really hinders our ability to ascribe conservation statuses. Next slide, Steve. And so, on the one hand, we wanted to really highlight what the diversity of Colorado's pollinators were. And so, with hundreds of species of butterflies and over 1,000 species of native bees now, we're one of the most diverse places in the world for bees. We have about 5% of global diversity of bees right here in Colorado and full 10% of all bumblebee species in the world. Next slide, Steve. But we also wanted to talk about how this long, rich history of research across the state has informed what we know about their conservation. For example, we have half as many insects today in protected alpine meadows outside Crested Butte as we did just 4 decades ago, as you can see in that figure in the upper left, long-term declines in insect abundance and biomass. And for some species, like bumblebees, a full fifth, 20% of the species we have here are now currently under review or petition for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And as you heard Lauren talk about, some of those are quite bad. So the western bumblebee, which used to be really broadly distributed across the western United States, has already declined some 60% across its entire range just over the past couple of decades and is predicted to become nearly extinct across the West by the 2050s. So these are really alarming stats that we brought to light. Next slide, Steve. And so, of course, we went through really detailed analysis of the primary drivers of habitat loss, climate change, pesticides and environmental pollutants, non-native species. And you can find all of those really detailed figures and studies within it itself. But I think from a policy perspective, one of the valuable things we did as researchers was to collectively talk about what we thought was the most negatively impacting our pollinators. And so I surveyed Colorado pollinator researchers and asked them what, for instance, was the factor that was most negatively impacting our pollinators. And as you can see, the height of those bars is the relative impact that they have. Most of our scientists think that climate change is probably the #1 most negative impacting factor we have on our native pollinators, followed closely by the main drivers of habitat loss, agricultural intensification, urbanization, and land management practices, including the use of pesticides, which both reduce habitat and degrade other habitat that bees could otherwise be using. How about next slide, Steve? But I also asked about not only those mechanisms that we know a lot about and have high confidence are negatively impacting the bees, but I also asked about what are the biggest gaps in our understandings of all these mechanisms that are driving bee communities. And this is kind of converse to what we think have the biggest impacts. These are the ones we don't know enough about, like the role that managed pollinators like honeybees or cultivated bumblebees play in wild bee communities. The role that non-native host plants, which have been here and native bees have evolved with for hundreds of years and sometimes to use, are playing in those community dynamics. And so these are areas that we don't know that much about, but we're pretty confident in the impacts of things like urbanization, agricultural practices, and pesticide use. Next slide, Steve. But when you put these two together and ask scientists, okay, well, you know where the risks are, you know where our gaps are, what do you think is the most potential to update policy and practice to mitigate these negative factors? And without a doubt, they think that pesticides are the #1 issue, right? We know without a doubt that most pesticides have developmental and lethal effects on our pollinator species. And so that would be a big win if we could get more policy or practice change around it. And so, again, big practice change or policy around agriculture, land management practices, urbanization, and managed pollinators, which we have pretty good ability to change at small scales. But things like non-native plants and climate change are global issues of moving things, carbon or species around the planet, and are much harder to address at local policy. Next slide, Steve. And so we used all of this information to kind of inform, and in combination with Steve's work with Xerces on the best management practices, what we called our 5 top priorities for pollinator conservation. And these should hopefully make a lot of sense to this group. That the #1 priority, if you're worried about pollinators, is that you need a mechanism to protect those imperiled native pollinating species. But that alone won't do much good unless you have priority 2, which is protect, restore, and connect to their habitats on which they depend. And then even if you protect those habitats, it won't matter unless you do priority 3, which is to mitigate all of those factors we just outlined, which are negatively impacting them and their habitats. And we thought that pesticides, of course, for priority #4 was such a big worry that it was probably worth being its own priority. And then a really collaborative effort, priority 5, was the need to monitor and support both native and managed pollinator health. Because let's face it, the best thing for our wild bees are healthy honeybee hives. And understanding how to do that and how they interact with our native bees is one of the most important things we need right now. So, next slide, Steve. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Steve, who's actually going to talk about management practices for pollinators. Thanks, Steve.
Great, thanks, Adrian and Joyce. Yeah, I think bringing in the context of how you provide shape to community interests, really get policy to provide support for making sure there's practices happening on the ground, and to help validate that through why this is important, the biology, the ecology, the science behind what we knew are all kind of key to the study. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, but really the focus as well is to make sure there are recommendations that from a state standpoint that could be acted upon on the land to make improvements in the way lands were managed that would hopefully make better habitat or conditions for our pollinators. So, as a key component for the work underway in Colorado, we really did want to engage with land managers and develop recommendations for practices that are meaningful, practical, and that benefit pollinators. In essence, collaborate with the people who are responsible for taking the actions that translate into on-the-ground changes. This meant that there was important work to do to engage with those land managers, learn about current practices, understand what they're doing, why, how are the rights of ways along our highways being mowed or managed, what sort of weed management practices were occurring in state wildlife areas or state parks, what sort of forest thinning operations were occurring for wildfire mitigation efforts, all kind of examples of what was out in the practices being occurred, and then also what were some of those practices that might benefit pollinators, and where we knew we might be able to make some recommended changes. We wanted to understand something about the strengths and weaknesses of the existing practices to help make meaningful recommendations. How well were some of the existing practices achieving their stated goals, but where maybe they were falling short, so we can make sure we could think about that as we were making recommendations. Adaptive measures that were already in play, and knowing ways that we might be able to, again, help to integrate in existing processes to understand, where we can make suggestions for changes. And all this kind of was underpinning really what we were trying to drive, was to make sure that we were exploring with the state land managers ways that we could put forth recommendations for practices that would be suitable for pollinators or accommodate better pollinator habitat goals, while also making sure we are serving well the goals of the land managers to meet their purposes and reasons for managing the lands. So to go at trying to kind of collaborate with a lot of different land managers across many different state agencies, one of the things we wanted to do would make sure we had kind of a variety of tools to assist us in that process. One of the tools, certainly, a very capable and broad brush approach, was to look at using a survey, so that we could at least, get sampling across, the range of different agencies that were responsible for managing lands in Colorado, but also, the different roles that different staff had, and the ways that there was a lot of operations occurring on the ground. We were fortunate to have, 53 land managers participate in a survey, which we were very pleased with, in spite of the fact that we actually put in front of them, up to 63 questions, just to really make sure, with this one chance of really doing this breadth of study, that we had a good basis for understanding about the different practices that were at play. But, the broad brush doesn't really allow you to get much into the details. And so that's where we wanted to make sure we also had the capacity, because it's fairly time intensive, to have conversations with land managers to really understand, the limits of certain practices, or why certain practices were at play. And then also, if we were talking about potential practices or recommended practices, to really understand maybe the constraints of how they could be implemented, some of the barriers that they may face. So we actually were able to have, fairly lengthy, over 90-minute conversations with 12 different land managers to try to really sooth out some of the details behind, current practices, but also make our recommendations, more applicable. And then kind of as a last just check-in or ability to have a sounding board, we had an advisory team as well as part of the study, just kind of continually give us a pulse check about how things were going and if there were, suggestions they had to make sure, again, what we were putting forth was really practical and appropriate in a lot of sense for the various landscapes in Colorado. So we had 7 land managers representing 5 different agencies participated on an advisory panel for us and helped kind of steer where recommendations were going. So the survey itself as an engagement tool was helpful at learning about which practices different agencies used and the frequency of their use. Example there is which agencies allowed or had prescribed grazing occurring, which ones, utilized various pesticide practices, how the frequency of some of those practices. And we also, learned what we thought maybe, hey, there could be a practice that is maybe being used less than what we might anticipate. And an example there is that, we've certainly, kind of fits in a little bit with Lauren's talk, is prescribed fire is, can be an important forest tool or grassland tool for managing habitat, but we kind of quickly learned that through both the survey and the interviews that actually presents a real challenge for our state land managers, partly due to capacity limitations and liability limitations. So in a very practical sense, it really isn't a tool that state land managers were able to utilize all that much. So we all kind of give us a heads up that may be an area where we can make sure we provide recommendations around, but may not also be all that feasible at this time for many of our state practitioners. To get at feasibility, the survey also was a good starting point to get a sense of what was possible amongst various management practices, and to understand some of the aspects of a potential new or adjusted practice that might make it more beneficial to use and maybe more applicable for pollinators. A good example here would be the level of feasibility for increasing the use of native pollinator attractive plants. So we, from a survey standpoint, that we got feedback across agencies that certainly was a very possible type of strategy that was being used or could be used. But through kind of the interview process, we were able to actually tease out a little bit more that while it certainly was desired and wanted, that there were clear constraints that land managers were also facing, in the sense that and I think something many of us face, there were certain limits on the availability of the native plant resources, whether that was seed or plant stock resources, and also challenges to get the expertise available or the technical guidance about how to best support those native additions to landscapes, whether it's a seed or a vegetative planting, and be able to propagate it in a particular site. So, to be practical about the constraints that might be at play. We also were able to kind of tease out some of the other barriers that may be out there associated with implementing pollinator-friendly practices. The survey could help kind of point some of these out, which might be more, roadblocks in the past. So, certainly fiscal considerations or maybe technical training gaps. But then we needed to really kind of delve in through the interview process to really understand some of the implications behind that. Here's an example for just looking at weed management practices that through, both the survey and the interview approach, we could look at kind of some of the specific examples of different takes at weed management that might be available to land managers, get a sense of how frequently they may be used, and and then also some of the barriers that might be at play for implementing some of these. We wanted to take a look at the managing for the spread of noxious and invasive weeds as an example, just to understand how frequent a practice that is, and also some of the potential constraints. And through a little bit of teasing from the survey, but mainly through the conversations in the interviews, we could understand, like from the highway department, that while that maybe a practice that was somewhat common, that they wanted to make sure they were dealing and had requirements to deal with noxious weeds, the real challenge they faced oftentimes was getting access again to the technical training that helps support the identification and the guidance about how to deal with various noxious weeds. And then even kind of going a step further through kind of the ongoing conversation with those weed managers, we also learned that there was an additional barrier that with some of the highway staff, and especially those that were out managing the weeds, there was frequent turnover of staff. So even though you might have a training program that gets people up to speed, the turnover of the staff actually ended up resulting in a dilution of the retention of that information. So, there were real barriers at play that, were getting in the way of making effective on the go practice improvements. Things that we wanted to make sure if we're making recommendations, we were acknowledging and making sure, while, there may not be solutions to everything, to make sure that was pointed out so that we could help support staff in figuring those solutions out. So through the process of all the interviews and the surveys and kind of the guidance from the advisory panel, we were able to then provide recommendations for 8 different kind of topic areas that we wanted to provide management recommendations around. So to really provide some thought around, here's just an overall good practice for pollinator conservation, and then actually provide recommendations about how that could play out for our state land managers, and then make sure that was built in with some understanding that there is barriers, there's constraints that would need to be attended to make changes in the practices to improve for the pollinators, and in that sense to help at least make sure there was a reality test for what we were providing as a recommendation. The end result here is that we, for each of those kind of 8 topic areas, and I won't go through them all, and I'll just kind of give some examples here. We were able to, I think, provide in the end, suggestions of here are ways that the state can, reinforce existing practices and add new practices, whether that's for forest shrubland habitats or other environments that would be, beneficial for pollinators and help us on the road for conservation. So here's an example where just with forest and shrublands and trees, and I think again ties into Lauren's presentation, the maintenance of and maintaining forest patches with intermittent openings would be a great advantage as we're doing forest mitigation, or to make sure that's in thought, and also with fire mitigation activities to make sure, as long as it's compatible with the overall safety goals, is to leave woody debris behind it, again, to make sure that we're providing adequate nesting sources for the pollinators that may need to use that for habitat. Here's another example here for existing, creating new pollinator habitat or restoring habitat. The common recommendations are making sure you have sequential blooms in place. So if you're designing and planting a habitat, restoring a site, to make sure you're really thinking about the consistency of having floral resources for our pollinators, and also not just kind of limiting those resources as floral resources, but making sure you're incorporating other nesting and overwintering habitat needs, whether that's bare ground or kind of in the previous example, leaving some woody structures available for our pollinators. And just a third example was, a suite of recommendations around integrated pest management and pest risk reduction. So, whether, an agency would benefit from a IPM or ideally an IPPM plan, to make sure that there are practices in place to do the best to kind of reduce the use of potential pesticides and ideally even mitigate the risk if there was necessity to be able to use pesticides. So that's just kind of a quick example of some of the recommendations, but I would encourage you to look more carefully at the length of the study for a lot more about, because there's, it's hard to condense a whole range of the possible work to even, all the different aspects of what work happens in Colorado and how those practices can be shaped to benefit our pollinators. So in kind of pulling this all together, some of the things we wanted to leave you all with was just some of the lessons we learned by thinking about how you collaborate with your community constituents, your scientific constituents, and also your land managers within the state to really make on the ground improvements, to improve practices, the way we operate on our lands to benefit pollinators. So one of the fundamental things is, is that collaborative aspect, is to build and to maintain relationships across all these constituents. And really part of that building and the maintenance is oftentimes dependent upon finding the champions, finding the people who are like-minded or at least are engaged in and have interest in the topic. So make sure you are including your scientists and your practitioners to forge together that ability to support policy changes, to make sure that when there are changes happening on the ground, that there is a voice to help support why that change is important. So that kind of takes that building emphasis to create a change, but also that the voice to make sure you support that change over time. You sometimes have to be strategic in your timing. Luckily in Colorado, we had kind of the right legislative openness and willingness, the right agency openness and willingness, and certainly enough support amongst the communities to really say, okay, the time is right here to support something like the study occurring, and then to take that recommendations for that study and move forward with providing the ability for our state wildlife agency to actually take on studying and managing invertebrates. All were really kind of pinned upon that we had the interest in these items and across the different legislative or agency capacities to take this on. So be strategic. If it's the right time, move forward. If it's not, you may have to be a little bit patient. You do need to rally and continue to grow support, continue to gain and grow the support amongst the community, because that's going to be kind of the voice that's going to help throughout the processes to indicate that this is something the citizens, the community really values. And so you're going to want to continue to build support for that. And then throughout the process, no matter what, continually debrief, learn, adapt as you understand kind of what worked, what didn't work, and as Joyce mentioned, we just, there was runs at certain bills that certainly, faced challenges. And so maybe those weren't successful, but they kind of informed and helped us move forward the next or a follow-up bill that was in fact successful. So as we think about what we learned, we also want to think about kind of how do we look at success in the future. And for us, it's important to think about ways we can kind of not leave the land managers out on an island alone. We've got all these great ideas, but and they're probably likely to face some challenges. So how can we, both from the community, from nonprofits, from the scientists, how can we help support and continue to engage with those land managers in solving the real problems they're going to be facing? So be engaged in ongoing conversations. Joyce mentioned that, within our highway department, there's an ongoing pollinator group that a number of different representatives from organizations and the different agencies are involved in. I think the benefit there is that's a conversation to help address real problems some of the staff face and figure out ways we can kind of make changes to support addressing those challenges. Not always can you take a big leap. Sometimes you may have to take a small step, but even that small step is important. I think we've taken some big leaps here in Colorado recently, but right now the state's facing some, financial constraints. So, we're needing to moderate back some of what can we want to move forward this year? And so it may be a time for, we've taken some big leaps, but maybe it's time for a small leap or a small step, but that's an important step too. So take advantage of movement and moving forward, even though sometimes it may not be as much of an opportunity as you may hope for. And then always keep an eye out for where's the next level of collaboration, where's the next opportunity where you can build momentum or strengthen a relationship, and maybe tackle one of your bigger leaps, because maybe the timing, the climate has changed and it's time to take a next step. So I think, well, we certainly, as part of the study and the work that we're doing, we recognize there's a lot of, threats and risks for our pollinators, but we also understand there's a lot of good that can come from this. And so I'll turn this over to Adrian for a few final thoughts here.
Next slide there, Steve. I'll just wrap up real quick. I know we're over time by just saying, the Wagner et al. Paper, which everybody knows, calls the loss of pollinators and other insects, death by 1,000 cuts. And Xerces really did instrumentally collaboratively develop this figure for the study, which was, if we know what's killing them, death by 1,000 cuts, really what you guys are doing is healing our landscapes with 1,000 stitches. And so we need to be thinking about how we manage all of our working landscapes or urban areas and our conservation programs for pollinators. So I think